Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I want to talk to you a little bit about Death of a Salesman, and I thought I'd go over a specific element or aspect of Death of a Salesman that I tend to find pretty interesting. Uh, we're going to apply to the play uh, the idea of the tragic hero, of the tragedy. Now, many of you have read tragedies before. These are types of plays. But if you read Death of a Salesman, you wouldn't necessarily think that you were reading some sort of classic tragedy. So I want to go through what that is, what a tragic hero is, and see if we really think that Willy Loman fits these categories. So let's go through it. First of all, let's look at some of the tragic heroes you might have read before. You might have read about Oedipus here. That's what I call him. King of Thieves. He's Sophocles. A lot of people read this. It was written by Sophocles. A lot of people read this freshman year. They read Oedipus Rex. If you remember, it's about the king who, at the beginning of the play, he's king. There's a plague in his country. He has to find out why. And he finds out it's because the guy that killed the old king is still in the city, and he has to find out who that is. Of course, we find out that it was actually him. He killed the old king. He just didn't know it was the king. And then he finds out, of course, too, that king was actually his father, that he didn't know that. And he married the queen, which then he found out was his mother, and he had kids with his mother. And at the end, he pokes his eyes out and gets kicked out of town. So we have this guy that starts off at the top as king and ends up just completely hated and kicked out of town because of what he'd done, even if he didn't know it. You probably read Romeo and Juliet. You would have read that freshman year. This isn't technically a classical tragedy from Greek or Roman drama, but it is Shakespearean. And we have Romeo, who you probably, I guess, would consider the tragic hero. Juliet is too, to a certain degree. But both of them are distinguished children of very wealthy families. They're very high class people. And we end up seeing them both dead at the end of the play. There's a good chance that you read sophomore year, last year, Macbeth. That's another Shakespeare play. And he was a revered Scottish nobleman and general at the very beginning of the play, even becomes king, but then, of course, we know at the end, completely loses it all and dies. So how does Willy Loman, the main character of our play here, a failed, door-to-door salesman, guy that goes out and tries to sell things every day and is not doing a great job of it in his old age, how is he somehow similar to these characters as a tragic hero? Well, first of all, what I'm going to explain to you is something that Arthur Miller was doing on purpose. He believed that the same characteristics that can be applied to the tragic hero in classic tragedy, can also be applied to the modern common man. Now, we noticed that all those people from that list were quite impressive. At the beginning of the play, they were all, nobles or really powerful people. But he believed that one does not have to be royalty or of such high degree as those people to be considered a tragic hero. And he tried to show this idea in his play, The Death of a Salesman. So what I'm going to go through are some of the traits of the tragic hero that Aristotle discussed when he was talking about tragedy. And what I'm going to challenge you to do in your homework for the next section is to find a quote where you can find how Willy Loman can somehow be shown to match up to one of these traits of the tragic hero. So let's check it out. First of all, the story of a tragic hero leads up to and includes his death. Spoiler alert. Well, it was called The Death of the Salesman. Sometimes it's not a literal death, though. Oedipus doesn't die at the end of Oedipus Rex, but he does end up, losing the light of life because he pokes his eyes out. So that kind of works. The story depicts only the troubled part of the hero's life. So if you take something like Oedipus, he had a lot of heroic parts of his life that led up to the part where the play starts, where he killed or defeated a sphinx, became king, was a big hero, but the tragedy only shows their downfall. So Willy Loman, even through, we might see through flashbacks, had some good times when he was younger. This part, it enters in with him already losing it and just getting worse and worse. Now, this is something that you could argue about, but one thing that should be true of what's going on with the tragic hero is that what they're going through, their suffering and the calamity is exceptional or extreme. Like they're going through some really bad stuff. It can't just be minor inconveniences. It can't be just, boy, I'm getting old and I can't run as fast as I used to. There need to be bad things happening to these people. So you kind of have to decide if that's true about what's going on to Willy Loman right now. And their suffering needs to extend beyond the hero and affect others. It needs to be like a big deal that other people are suffering because this person is suffering. So you have to decide if that's true of Willy and his family. Usually, the tragic hero, at some point in the play, learns from his suffering and agony, and his awareness lies in a deeper understanding of the human condition. So he kind of learns a lesson from everything he's gone through. What we have here is Othello, who kills his wife because he thought she was cheating on him, but she wasn't. And he finds that out right before he kills himself in the play, and he learns this lesson about, trust and jealousy and his own foolishness. So he has this kind of almost enlightenment at the very end. Now, the fall of the character is usually caused by some error or frailty in the protagonist, known often as a tragic flaw. It tends to be something, they have some kind of character flaw that causes their downfall. Often, in especially classic plays like Greek plays, hubris or excessive pride is often the tragic flaw. It's very important in Greek mythology that mankind or men knew their place in relationship to the gods, that they were lower than the gods, and that they didn't think too much of themselves. So often they'll be punished when they try to act too high and mighty, because the gods can just show them who's who. So pride is often a tragic flaw of the tragic hero. Now, usually for the audience, the tragedy should arouse emotions of pity and or terror in the audience in a way that cleanses people of these emotions. So, you feel so bad and so sad about what's happening that at the end you just go, whew, that was hard, but we went through it, and I feel kind of better now just watching something like that. It's almost like when you cry in a movie because something's sad, it releases emotions. It's almost a way to get things out. There's a word for this. It's called catharsis. You might have heard someone say that an experience they had was cathartic. Usually means they were able to get some emotions out or deal with some emotions by going through that experience. Now, the tragic hero should be worthy of our interest, concern, or sympathy. An evil or depraved character cannot be a tragic hero. This means we can't hate the main character, because if something bad happens to a villain, it's not a tragedy, it's justice. We go, oh, okay, good. You can't have the tragedy of Hitler or something like that. If something bad happens to Hitler, we're happy. It's not tragedy. So if we can be sympathetic with a character and see how something bad happens to them, then, we see that there's something tragic in it. Now, I know a lot of you don't love Willy Loman. So you'll have to see if you can at least find some way to kind of feel bad for him, because then we can see that the suffering he goes through is, a shame. It's tragic that he's going through it. Now, here's probably the hardest one for Willy Loman. Usually, in classic tragedy, the tragic hero is of some sort of high degree or nobility. They're a king or a nobleman. They start off at the top of society, and then we see their downfall. This is sometimes hard for students to think about Willie Loman as something like this. Like here, we have a king. We have a Burger King. He's of high degree or nobility. If something bad happened to the Burger King, it would be terrible. Everybody would watch it and be horrified. But what about Willie Loman? He's just some kind of schmo who didn't do very well in his life and now is kind of losing it. Well, I want to read this quote to you. This is a very famous quote, especially the part from Linda. So this is when Biff and Happy are kind of arguing with Linda. And, Willie's been walking around talking to himself. And Biff and Happy are like, what's wrong with him? Willie's kind of mean sometimes, so they're complaining about that too. And so Biff says, he's got no character. Charlie wouldn't do this, not in his own house, spewing out that vomit from his mind. Happy says, Charlie never had to cope with what he's got to. Hey, people are worse off than Willie Loman. Believe me, I've seen him. And then here's a very important moment from Linda, Willie's wife. Then make Charlie your father, Biff. You can't do that, can you? I don't say he's a great man. Willie Loman never made a lot of money. His name was never in the paper. He's not the finest character that ever lived. So if we pause there, it seems like Linda is arguing against what we're saying of somehow believing that Willie is of high degree or nobility. She just said he's not a great man. He never made a lot of money. Doesn't even have the finest personality. But we have to see what she says as she continues. But he's a human being, and a terrible thing is happening to him. So attention must be paid. He's not to be allowed to fall into his grave like an old dog. Attention must be finally paid to such a person. You called him crazy. I didn't mean, no. A lot of people think he's lost his balance. But you don't have to be very smart to know what his trouble is. The man is exhausted. Sure. A small man can be just as exhausted as a great man. He works for a company 36 years. This March opens up unheard of territories to their trademark, and now in his old age, they take his salary away. So we learned one thing is that now he's on pure commission. He doesn't even really make any money doing this, even though he's worked for a place for 36 years. But what Linda's point is look, just because he is not some great, powerful individual doesn't mean that his life doesn't matter. What he's going through is sad. If you want to know who has high degree or nobility or extreme worth to their lives, all people do. Even Willie, who's annoying sometimes seems too mean, is kind of a failure in business. When something bad happens to him, it's still sad. And I think you can find enough sympathy for Willie while you're reading the play to be able to feel bad for him. But that's one of the things I think going on here is that all humans are of some high degree or nobility, of high worth, because they're human. It's a very American idea, too, if you think about it. It's very equal in the way it thinks of people's worth, of the individual's worth. So we'll look more at this. One of your homework questions on your homework for this section is to find a quote that lines up with one of the traits of the tragic hero. Don't use this one because I already used it, but find your own. Okay, guys, I'll see you at our Zoom meeting on Friday. Hope you're all doing well.